I am Bryce Newberger, and this is the Kinship Chronicles, Children of the Phoenix. Chapter 22. The sun set low through the mountain trees as the somber procession of knights returned from the massacre at Ridgewood. Their garments were covered in blood and the ashes of innocent victims they were forced to dispose of. Audience that met them was one part outraged and two parts mortified. Word was already spreading throughout the kingdom, and rumors of war were circulating. From high up in the royal antechamber, the regally dressed man's head dropped in sadness as he watched from the balcony overlooking the scene. Behind him, the other advisors remained seated, waiting for the king to return to the council to begin. When word came that their leader was returning, the man took his seat at the coveted third chair from the king. No one said a word until King Denigno had entered the room, sat down, and reconvened the meeting with a sigh and a feeble wave of his hand. At that, everyone erupted once again into a tumultuous clamor, all except for the king and the man sitting 3 chairs from him. Denigno hushed the gathering of advisors. His heart was heavy and burdened. To the procession, it seemed as if the king's own kin had been murdered. All the advisors seemed outraged. Next to the king, the War Master's heart was beating heavy in his large chest, in the second chair away. The Grand Ecclesial was rubbing his brows with consternation, but only the other looked as mournful as the king. It was the man sitting 3 chairs away. The king called on his like-minded compatriot. "Grexus, why don't you begin?" The bald, tattooed, blue-eyed archmage sighed and rubbed his head. "To avoid the loss of more life, we need to conscript a larger army. Emperor Rysval is clearly out to make an example of us to the other kingdoms that may still yet refuse him." The Grand Ecclesial stood up. "We don't know for certain it was Rysval. Why would he risk war with us while the gap in numbers between our 2 forces is still so small?" voiced the War Master. "War. And there's little sense in war, or those who seek it," the king reflected quietly. Grexus concealed his pleasure from those in the room, but for him, all was going according to plan. After the long meeting concluded, Grexus walked into his grand chambers reserved for the Archmage. The room was kept darkly lit by candlelight, which could not reflect all the way to the top of his high-vaulted ceiling. His walls were lined with shelves containing rare commentaries on the nature of magic and diaries from masters long dead. His door shut, he sat at his desk, and without looking, he spoke. "Give me your report, Artemis." The regent mage of Ridgewood dropped from the darkness of the vaulted ceiling. "Archmage," he began with an overly humble bow, "the guild hall has been destroyed, and the terrors you sent us are either lost or dead." There was an uneasy pause as Grexus didn't change his demeanor, or even blink for that matter. He waited for Artemis to proceed. After clearing his throat, Artemis continued, "It was not natural cause that was our undoing. It was another mage named Dazon. I don't know how, but he seems to use multiple forms of magic, though he's not a terror." At this, Grexus leaned forward with interest. "Was he the one who made the Mages Guild crumble?" Dazon watched the fire die into low embers. The raging inferno now rested into tranquility. Such is the nature of life, he reflected. At any moment the right poke and breath could spark these coals into a fury. Facing away from the fire sat the small boy whose life now reflected the pit. His family had gone up in flame that was influenced by Dazon. He now had time and energy to replay the events from the previous night. The rush of battle, the sting of wounds, the madness of his victory. The violent play ended with the dead couple embraced in their restful position, forever awaiting their curtain call. These were the boy's parents, and Dazon had killed them. There was a moment of remorse before Dazon recollected himself. He was on a mission, and this was war. Innocents die and tragedy abounds. It is sad, unfair, and it is life. He had saved the boy and owed him nothing. The meat was hung over the fire to dry out into a jerky that would last long over their journey. Dazon had to spend the night tending the fire and keeping hungry animals away from the camp. He heard a rustling echo nearby, probably an animal lurking in the distance, awaiting the precise moment to strike and take the spoils. Dazon would have to remain awake the whole night, a feat he could easily accomplish, but one he would not appreciate. He was not alarmed by stray predators scraping out a living for themselves in the wild, but it was the next sound which caused Dazon to rise to his feet in a defensive stance. It was the muttering and babbling of an insane human. The near-nude terror emerged from the tunnel into the low light. He had a half-smile, half-grimace on his face, and blood dripped from a gaping chest wound he received from Dazon the night before. The creature should have died, It made no sense for this abomination to still draw breath. Dazon cursed his carelessness. He remembered now that Artemis was a flesh shaper and must have worked his foul craft on this tormented horror to shift vital organs away from their natural place. He would make sure this monster was put out of his misery this time. Before he could strike, the ground beneath him shot up and catapulted him into the darkness of the forest. Before he hit the ground, he could hear a similar pop of the ground, ejecting the terror as well. The hard smack, he met the ground back first. There would only be a fraction of a second before the terror landed on him. Instinctively, he swung his hand for a sword, but as his fingers found the scabbard empty, he remembered he had left his sword unsheathed next to him at the fire. He must have lost it in midair. This was carelessness and clumsiness. The constant danger and lack of sleep was finally going to catch up to him. This was how many warriors die, stressed, tired, and at their wits' end. He knew he deserved his fate for allowing himself to reach this state. With a heavy headbutt, the terror crashed into the black-clad warrior and pinned Dazon's arms to his side. The naked attacker was screaming, "Help me!" as he rammed his face into Dazon's skull over and over. In the darkness, he could feel slick, wet blood covering him as the terror was bludgeoning them both to death. Cal had awoken from the loud sound of earth shifting. He looked up to see his shadowy companion was gone, and 2 large sections of rocky earth had come up from the ground. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he laid back down onto his bedroll. "Help me!" he heard the forest scream. Cal was up again in a flash of movement. He looked off into the blackness, hearing smacks and chattering. "Help! Help! He clenched his fists and walked slowly towards the sound of struggle. There was a snap and a spark, then a flame caught the grass nearby. Now, with a little light, Cal could see that his companion was pinned by the naked loincloth man from before. With an anger risen from the depths of his anguish, he blamed the monster for his family's death. Cal stared hard at the creature. He saw Eldrich stepping out in front of Ox to defend him. Cal shifted his gaze to the burning fire. He saw Amora pulling him away from his fight with the bully. He flexed his childish frame as he began to tense. He saw Teddy run up and hug him, then look into his face in anticipation to play a game. Cal screamed in rage. He saw his father pick him up and spin him around into embrace. He saw his mother set dinner in front of him, then poke his vegetables with a wink. He saw picnics and reunions and fishing and laughing and crying. Cal stomped on the ground and the fire from the pit sparked to life, then flew into the air where it clung to the flesh of the terror like a magnet to metal. The creature squealed and flapped and rolled. "Help me! Help me!" For once the cry matched the plea, but the fire only burned hotter and hotter until a hushed whistle snuffed the flames and left little but smoldering ash. The charred terror reached for Cal as the boy walked closer to his victim. He let out one final struggled gasp and breathed no more. Dazon had evacuated the burn radius unscathed. His face was bloodied and bruised, but that didn't matter to him. The young boy had just displayed an impressive psychic link with fire and saved him from the gruesome end. Dazon stood fixated on what the boy would do next or how he would handle the ruin or wrath he had just enacted. The boy was breathing heavy and wouldn't move. Dazon was not equipped to console children, but he walked up anyways, trying to figure out what to say. He felt he owed the boy something. When he saw the boy's face, he decided to say nothing at all. Cal was smiling with satisfaction. He would no longer fear the monsters of the dark. Artemis struggled to explain how he fled the scene, leaving the mage alive. Grexis would not be pleased with both failure and cowardice. "You see, my lord, that if I had not fled here, you would have been left completely in the dark regarding these matters." Grexis looked at Artemis without betraying his true emotion. "You are correct, Artemis." He stood up and crossed the room to face the regent mage. "You are to be commended for your service. Now, there is another issue of concern. That is, your position in the guild. You are a regent mage with no guild hall. Perhaps you should be assigned to a position that better fits your survival skills." Artemis knew that was not a good thing. Grexis went on, "Find this Dazon and bring him back alive. I would very much like to pick his brain." There was a double meaning to that last phrase, and it was lost on Artemis. For once in his life, Artemis decided humility might serve his purpose better than flattery. "I'm not sure I possess the right skills to obtain such a talented individual. Perhaps a terror would better serve you." "An astute judgment," said Grexis as he placed a hand on Artemis's cheek. "Let's alter your talents." The regent mage's eyes went wide. Then they went blank. His smooth talk had been his undoing. Thank you for listening. I'm Bryce Newberger, and this has been the Kinship Chronicles, Children of the Phoenix. If you enjoyed what you heard and you'd like to purchase the full book, then either look up New Books on the Google Play bookstore, NEU Books, or simply click the link in the description. The book is only $5, and I appreciate your support.